Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Got a lot of folks joining today, so I'll just give them a minute to get here in the Zoom room. Well, great. Again, thank you so much for joining today's Diverse Talk Live. This is part 2 of meeting the mental health needs of minority college students. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode, but please feel free to ask questions at any time using that Q&A panel found in your Zoom window. We will get to all questions as time allows after the panelist discussion. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce David Pews, Executive Director here at Diverse. Welcome, David. The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Wendy. Thank you so very much, Wendy. Just so glad to be here with all of you. I'd like to thank everybody who registered for part 2 of our webcast, Meeting the Mental Health Needs of Minority College Students. Part 1, we had a tremendous response. We had many questions, many more questions than we could answer. And so I'd like to thank our panelists for agreeing to part 2. So many issues, so much to discuss, so much that is vital for our higher education institutions to make sure that they stay on top of with regards to meeting these critical needs. I just want to get right into it. Let me reintroduce our panel and introduce our new panelists. First panelist I'd like to introduce Nahed Barakat. Dr. Barakat is a licensed clinical psychologist and interim training director, coordinator of diversity and inclusion initiatives at the University of Denver. Thank you so much, Nahed, for being back with us. Nathan Demers, licensed clinical psychologist, vice president of clinical programs and strategic partnerships with you at college. Nathan, thank you so much for being back with us. Amy Gatto, senior manager of higher ed and evaluation with Active Minds. Thank you so much, Amy, for being with us. And I'd like to introduce a new panelist for part 2, Sasha Zoe. Dr. Zoe, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Public Health with Wayne State University. Sasha, thank you so much for being with us. And Sasha, I want to go ahead and ask you the first question. Sasha, can you talk a little bit about your background, how you got into this work in terms of working in the mental health field in a higher education context? And I was wondering if you also talk about some of the most salient issues that you feel our audience should know, Sasha.
Thank you for that introduction, David. So again, my name is Sasha Zoe. I'm an assistant professor at Wayne State University in Detroit. And I started working in kind of higher ed mental health, actually in graduate school at the University of Michigan, School of Public Health. I worked closely as a grad student with the Healthy Minds Network, which is, for those of you who don't know, is a research to practice network dedicated to improving kind of like the mental and emotional well-being of young people. And so the main research endeavor of this Healthy Minds Network is our survey, the Healthy Minds Survey. It's a national survey focused on undergraduate and graduate student mental health and related issues that has been running since 2007. And so now we have about 500,000 students and 500 campuses that have participated in our survey to date. So I have since graduated, and I am now a co-investigator on the network, and have used this data for a lot of my projects, including my dissertation work, where I use survey data and focus group data to understand and assess the influences of mental health and characteristics of mental health service use, specifically among Asian Pacific Islander, DAISY American College University students. And in this COVID era, I've also worked on a couple projects related to COVID-19 discrimination experience, specifically focused on Asian Pacific Islander identifying students. And so now I'd say, My research broadly uses mixed methods to understand and address mental health needs in this like emerging adult college student population. And I've always kind of had a focus of my work on underserved populations. So this includes students of color, international students, as well as sexual and gender minorities. And so recently, kind of my work has now expanded to thinking, especially through this COVID area, kind of looking at campus climate and policies and how they would relate to mental health and help-seeking behaviors, and what we can do actually at the campus level, the institution level, to better support student mental health, and also kind of connect students to treatment services who are disproportionately underutilizing formal treatment avenues. So that's just a little bit about me. I started working in my dissertation on specifically Asian Pacific Islanders, because in the Healthy Mind Survey, we found that this population of students kind of disproportionately underutilized treatment compared to other student populations that we've examined in our survey. And then since then, we've also seen like kind of a decrease in treatment utilization among Arab American and Middle Eastern student population as well. So my most recent bigger project that I'm working on is at Wayne State. We actually have a large population of Arab American and Middle Eastern students. And so I've been developing a mixed methods project kind of focused on kind of mental health and help seeking in this population.
Thank you so much, Sasha. And you bring up a question that we've had posed in various ways. The title, of course, of this webinar, Meeting the Mental Health Needs of Minority College Students. What is minority? A better word probably is minoritized. Obviously, when we're talking about minority students, we're thinking of students on the margins, and that includes, of course, disabled students, veterans in some cases, LGBT in some cases. And so my first question, and I'll probably start with Nathan, and I'm going to ask our other panelists to jump in as well. Nathan, I was wondering if you could talk about what are the unique challenges of students who are minoritized, students who are not in the mainstream. Generally speaking, and perhaps if you have some specific examples, that'd be helpful as well. What are the unique challenges of students who are in the minority, and what should higher education institutions realize and understand when it comes to making sure they don't fall through the cracks when it comes to dealing with their mental health?
It's an incredibly big question, as you know, especially when we're speaking to so many different minority students who are minoritized in different ways. Of course, the experience of a student veteran is going to be so different than a member of the LGBTQ plus IA community, which is going to be different than a Latinx student who's attending Cal State Fullerton than in rural Montana. But of course, the common thread there is a lot of times students who are minoritized do not feel like a lot of interventions on campus are specifically made for them. They may not see themselves as traditional consumers of the counseling center or other support services. And our data really supports that, in that students who are minoritized tend to access traditional in-person supports at lower rates than majority populations. And I really think, and I'm sorry, I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old at home. I'm sure you could just hear a scream in the background. I don't know what happened. Everyone's fine. The biggest thing is that we are going out of our way to make sure students are feeling welcomed and that they know these services are indeed designed for them and their unique circumstances. The last thing I'll share with you, at college, we're at 180 campuses now. And when we look at our data, the experiences and what content that students are looking at from, I'm just going to use Latinx again, at campus A is oftentimes very different than campus B, is very often different than campus C. So to pull the layers of the onion back further, it's not enough work to just go and look at data and say, oh, this is what, let's say, the Steve Fund is saying are the biggest challenges for Latinx students. That's really helpful information, but you also need to know what the experience of students of Latinx background are experiencing on your specific campus. And unfortunately, there's no magic bullet or way around getting that data. We have to listen to these students, go out of our way, do surveys, do research, and do a lot of firsthand focus groups to be able to support them to the best of our ability. I'd love to kick it over to the other panelists as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Nathan said. And to add to that, I think an issue that a lot of students can face is what kind of campus they're on, right? So if you have minoritized students who are on a predominantly white campus, it is very hard to feel like you belong. Sometimes it is very hard, especially if a lot of offices, a lot of faculty and staff do not look like you, do not represent people from your community. And so it does feel like an added barrier for students to access services. And this is part of my job, is to go out to the students and go to them and kind of see what their needs are instead of expecting them to come to us. So I would say that's just an additional thing that often comes up.
And I think going along with that too is empowering students to be part of the conversation and not just having or tokenizing certain students on campus to bring these issues forward. So back to what Nathan was saying about working with students, asking those questions and letting them see change. So much of our work when we talk to students is they have really great ideas and they want to see their ideas implemented or actioned upon. And as administrators or leaders or counselors in the counseling center, it's really connecting with those students, elevating those concerns, and then letting them see what vocalizing their concerns can do on their campus. They're really elevating and amplifying voices, which isn't always the case on every campus.
Sasha, you mentioned in your intro that there are perhaps some concerning trend lines when it comes to the rate at which minoritized students actually access available services, right? And I was wondering if you might address maybe some specifics, what higher education administrators should be doing with regards to making sure that minoritized students who may be reluctant to seek help can actually be encouraged to get the help that they need. Sasha, I was wondering if you might talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen that there's a treatment gap in our data among minoritized students, especially also a treatment gap, in first gen low income students. They're less likely to seek treatment when they're symptomatic. And so some things that we've talked about kind of in kind of like the Healthy Minds Network is thinking through like what campus structures can we really utilize to help better support students. So when I think a lot of the conversations are like, we need to connect students to treatment services. We need to connect them to treatment services. And I think that portion is still really important. But ultimately, like a lot of campuses are struggling to meet demand already. And we have a shortage of providers of color, providers from these backgrounds that students are really seeking. And so something that we've talked about a lot is kind of like how can we support students at like the campus level? Like what structures are on campus that we can really take advantage of? So maybe it's training academic advisors in this space, or our Healthy Mind study actually just piloted a faculty survey in which we talked to faculty about like how much training they have gotten in supporting student mental health. There's also some of our work has found that even just having like a physical space, like for minoritized students together, like some campuses have multicultural centers where they have a lot of activities, just kind of fostering those relationships we found to better support student mental health.
A number of our questions talked about or asked about the effect of this latest Omicron surge. We did part one of this webcast on December 7th, and Omicron was just, I think, coming to the fore. Since then, we know that the infection rate for Omicron is just tremendous. We also know that this pandemic has disproportionately impacted in a very negative way minoritized students as opposed to majority students. On the head, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the effects that you might have seen with regards to the surge of Omicron. How has Omicron affected, I would say, minoritized students from what you have seen? And what do higher ed administrators need to know with regards to how the fact that we are back seemingly in the throes of this pandemic is affecting their most vulnerable students?
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation. The two words that come to mind are exhaustion and anxiety. I think our students, and I would assume everybody, is just exhausted from the consistent sort of collective trauma that we keep going through, and it seems like it's never ending, right? Like anytime they see the light at the end of the tunnel, you get another variant, and that just makes it really hard. So on the one hand, I think for a lot of campuses, they did go online for the first couple of weeks of their semester or their quarter to protect the students. So that's really helpful from a public health perspective, right? And for students who have a lot of health anxiety. But on the other hand, like you said, it is exhausting, right? It reminds people of the early days of the pandemic when we were very anxious about what was going on. We didn't really know what was happening. So the things I have been noticing is students kind of feeling some despair around that. And I think with Omicron in particular, because it's so contagious, I think what we're seeing is that students are more concerned about their health than they were at the beginning, and they're more concerned about their family's health. So, this happened around the holidays, so a lot of students weren't able to go home, and that definitely had a very strong negative impact on their mental health. And then kind of with administrators kind of trying to find the balance between, okay, do we go on as normal because it's not as dangerous, but it's very contagious, but also recognizing that we still have a lot of students and their families who are immunocompromised, who are at high risk for getting COVID. And so I think it's confusion also, and students just kind of feeling like they don't know what to do anymore. They don't know what the right decision is. They don't know if they should mingle with their friends, go see their families. For some students, they actually have not seen their families since the beginning of the pandemic at all. And that has had a real serious impact on their levels of depression and anxiety and just kind of hopelessness overall. So it's been very difficult. I think that for administrators, I think the one thing to consider is just flexibility, right? There's not going to be a one size fits all solution to this, but there needs to be flexibility around, do we do hybrid classes? Do we allow students to do classes from home? If they feel comfortable, do they go to the classroom? But then also you add the component of faculty and staff considerations as well. You need a campus to run in order for the classes to run. And so how do you find that balance? So I think it's part of the exhaustion comes from like constantly transitioning, things changing really quickly and people not being able to keep up with it. So again, flexibility, I think, is the key here.
Go ahead, Amy.
Sorry, Nissan. Well, Nahed, I think you brought up this great point too about faculty, staff, and administrators, particularly some of our healthcare administrators, with constantly having to adapt and cope and figure out how to support students, how to support their staff, working to prevent burnout, and living kind of in the same reality that the rest of us do. Question marks, they don't know answers, coping with making sure students are being able to test, changing recommendations. And so on campuses too, I think there's a really strong consideration for what can we do to support faculty, staff, and our administrators' mental health during this time too, which consistently comes up. There's the phrase, you can't pour from an empty cup. And campuses are starting to realize that they need to move into supporting faculty and staff and administration's mental health in order to continue when I think a lot of us thought we would be in a very different place than we are right now.
Yeah, building off that, Amy, I was speaking with a dean of students at a large state university, and she shared that it's just a great quote that we are hurting people, helping hurting people. And as faculty and staff and helpers on campus, we are living through this too, and in very complex ways. And of course, we're giving our best, but that brings me to burnout. I think watching and being mindful of burnout on the faculty and staff side, as well as the student side, it's really hard to focus on your work when the environment and world around us is constantly changing. And that's further exacerbated, David, as you pointed out, in that many minoritized students are indeed disproportionately impacted, whether that's being in a home where I don't have adequate study space, I want to access therapy, but maybe I don't want to live within a home culture that's open and accepting of that. There's a number of burdens that I think oftentimes are not readily thought about by folks from historically, or excuse me, folks in the majority, because it's just not necessarily everyone's reality.
One of the questions was asking about how we can provide effective resources to faculty, of course, who are on the front lines of this issue. We know, of course, and Nathan, you mentioned the culture, and we know that there are many cultural barriers to seeking help, right? And so where a minoritized student might not go to the counseling center, the student, however, might confide in a faculty member. And I think that there are some faculty registrants to this webinar who are saying, all right, this is not necessarily my core job, but I am on the front lines. What do I need to know? What resources can I access as a faculty member who has minoritized students who are confiding in me? And so I'll kick that to Sasha, and I'll ask others to address that as well. Are there resources for faculty who are on the front lines? Are there resources that they can access? Where can they and should they go with regards to dealing with these frontline issues that many times, instead of going to, let's say, the counseling center, we know some of these students are going to their professors?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And the data has certainly supported everything that we've talked about. So in our faculty and student mental health survey, we found that like over 80% of faculty are reporting having one-on-one conversations with their students on mental health. And 3/4 of faculty are likely to reach out if a student is in distress, but less than half actually have a good idea on how to recognize when a student is distressed. So we've just found that faculty as a whole really do welcome more resources, and I think they're going to be very institutional dependent. But from our data, we found that faculty prefer trainings that are online, that offer just advice for general student support instead of just crisis training, because not all of the mental health challenges that we're seeing now in classrooms are at a crisis level. Sometimes they are just very general, moderate distress, but still negatively impacting student lives. I think in terms of supporting faculty themselves, you can think about what a department can do or what department chairs can do. So I think shifting from this, often in academia, we have this culture of bragging about how busy we are and how we're working so many hours. So shifting this culture from being overwhelmed with work to kind of talking about work-life balance and trying to bring in mental health into kind of departmental culture as well is important, and finding ways to just kind of humanize mental health challenges. So in some of the discussions that we've had on how we can better support students, we talk about being honest with students about your own mental health challenges. And I think that that's equally important for leadership in academic departments to do the same for their faculty members. So now we're not all living in this facade that everything is okay and we can still be as productive as we were before.
And I'd love to build on that. Thanks, Sasha. A couple of things. The first observation is culturally, there's been a nice shift over the last little while, kids still screaming in the background, sorry, that historically health and well-being on campus has been the responsibility of the counseling center and health promotion. And that obviously has really shifted in light of increasing mental health needs. This is even pre-pandemic, but obviously now everyone's talking about mental health in some way, shape, or form. And now we are indeed realizing that faculty and staff, cafeteria workers, RAs, everyone has a role in helping identify and refer students to appropriate care. Because as you pointed out, David, the first person to see a student in distress is not myself as a psychologist in the counseling center. So in my opinion, and Healthy Minds data actually supports this, I think it was 74% of faculty and staff said that they would like more training specifically regarding how to approach and support students experiencing some sort of mental health crisis. So the time is really now to start delivering on those services. There's some great training, things like mental health first aid. There's also a lot of great digital navigation tools out there so that, you know what, you don't have to know every answer, but campus has an app, whether that's a homegrown app or a third-party app, that can help connect that student in that moment to the right door on campus. The biggest thing, in my opinion, that is the biggest sort of way that students fall through the cracks is a faculty member has a discussion with a student and then gives them a card and says, we'll call the counseling center. The likelihood of that student following through is unfortunately so low. So if we have some sort of digital tool that a faculty member could go into right then and there, schedule that next appointment, or maybe walk that student over to that next service. That's how we can start to close these gaps. And we need to provide faculty members some training so that they can feel confident in doing so. And to be very clear, they don't have to have all the answers. They just need to know where to find those answers and plug students in.
Nathan, to build on that, prior to the pandemic, we were really seeing at Active Minds a need for faculty and staff to better support students. And one of our signature programs, VAR, Validate, Appreciate, and Refer, was a program that we were implementing for students so they could talk to each other and help students. So like what Sasha was saying, many times our students come talk to us before they're in crisis. And so actually having those conversations with each other and referring them to appropriate campus resources. During the pandemic, we've actually seen tremendous growth in the number of faculty and staff and administrators who are interested in trainings like this that are skills-based, they're grounded in personal experiences, and just work on motivational interviewing and supporting a student with what they're disclosing while also recognizing you don't have to be an expert, like Nathan said, but students want to know that you care and that you can support them. So I think there's so many things out there that exist, and I'm actually really excited for the Healthy Minds data from the faculty and staff survey. I think it's going to really help illustrate what our faculty and staff members are experiencing on campuses. So we will see more programs. I know there's a lot of existing strong resources, but really meeting those needs so faculty and staff can do a better job supporting students and making appropriate referrals versus just kind of giving the students a card and crossing their fingers that they do seek professional help.
I just want to remind our audience that we will be reserving our last 15 minutes or so for live Q&A. And so I encourage you to use the Q&A function within Zoom to send in your questions. And so we will be posing some live questions to our panel. Just want to remind our audience of that opportunity. Another question that came in more than once was PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I will actually ask this question of Nahed. Nahed, can you discuss the difference between racial trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder clinically?
Sure. Yeah, I think trauma is one of those words that has been part of the vocabulary over the past year and a half. I think people are starting to recognize a little bit more what that means. But I do want to be clear about the distinction between PTSD and racial trauma or any other type of trauma. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a clinical diagnosis that has to be made by a clinician. And really the hallmark of it is that there is usually a big traumatic event that happens. And then after the event is over, the person experiences certain symptoms, sort of like flashbacks, nightmares, re-experiencing of the traumatic event, things like that. And there is a specific time period where that needs to happen. So that is more thinking about, I think the best example that people can maybe think about is war veterans, right? After somebody has been in war, they've seen some stuff, they come back here and then they maybe get activated by fireworks, things like that. They have nightmares, and it's just it's a very, very intense experience that really impacts a person's functioning. Racial trauma, on the other hand, can be an ongoing issue that's happening to a person. So it's something that you are experiencing every day related to your race. Could be microaggressions, could be experiences of discrimination that are sort of ongoing, but they don't have the impact that you would have from other bigger events. And I say bigger, I use that very loosely, but I just mean that it's not a one distinct event that started and ended. It's an ongoing process. And so those are very different. The treatment approaches for them are very different, and the experiences are also just very different for people. Somebody can experience a very difficult traumatic experience and not develop PTSD. Somebody can have racial trauma ongoing and maybe experience some features of PTSD. So that is, I would say, the main difference. I don't know, Nathan, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. The only thing I'll add, just because in our society, I think a lot is in the general public not known about post-traumatic stress disorder. After a traumatic event, we find that about 20 to 30% of individuals will develop post-traumatic stress disorder after a very traumatic event that involved, a potential loss of life or serious bodily harm. And why I share that is it's important to remember that 70 to 80% of people do not develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Does that mean that they are fine? No, it means that they're having a normal response to trauma, that you might be stressed, you might be a little bit dissociated, you might be depressed, you might need some time to recover, really lean into your support system. But that's the difference in that, of course, everyone reacts to trauma differently, but not everyone is going to develop post-traumatic stress disorder.
Thanks so much. Next question I'd like to pose to Amy, and I'll ask my other panelists to jump in as well if they would like to comment. Amy, one of the questions we received is this. Could you please address the unique needs of LGBTQ students and how we can better support students in these communities? Amy, I was wondering if you could touch and address that question, please.
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And I think this is something we hear frequently at Active Minds, are how do we support our LGBTQ plus students on campuses? And there's a variety of ways to do this. We have resources that are student-led and student-driven. And I think this goes back to a lot of our conversation in the beginning of this webcast, talking about just understanding students' experiences on campus with those identities. And taking it even further, understanding intersectional identities, understanding microaggressions that our students experience, and then working with them to create a space that's supportive and can cultivate an environment to support their mental health. We know that during this time, many of our students are exploring their identities and having connections with counselors, with affinity groups, with safe spaces, providing cultural competency training, and actually carrying that out on campus, providing it to faculty, staff, students. Those are just some of the steps we can take to support students who identify as LGBT, but also using some of those same tenets that we spoke about earlier in including students in the conversation and making sure that their voices are amplified and elevated on campuses. I'd love to turn it over to some of the other panelists to speak to this as well.
Happy to provide a quick anecdote. I think one thing, going back to the data I was sharing, that sort of once you know one campus or one student, you know one campus or one student. I've worked with many students who, Amy, as you pointed out, are exploring their identities. You know, they decide that they identify as gay and they are so freed. They have a supportive family, they're able to be themselves. And then I've also worked with students who have a very similar experience. They're not in a supportive environment. They've had a traumatic experience with this. They're worried about their family's reaction. Those two scenarios are, of course, completely different, and those two students need to be treated completely different and supported in different ways. So again, I just share this anecdote as there's no one size fits all for how do we support this group of students or that group of students. We have to do the work to really understand who are we talking about, what's their context, and how can we do this on a more individualized basis as well.
The next question I'd like to send to Sasha. Sasha, I was wondering if you could answer this question. What are suggestions for helping immigrant minority students, especially those first-generation college students who struggle due to family issues? And the example used was family obligations that interfere with school, thus increasing mental stress. And so the question is with regards to helping immigrant minority students, particularly first-generation students. I wondering if you might address that, Sasha.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think that similar to a lot of the populations we've talked about today, immigrant international students are not a monolith. So they're coming from very different countries of origin. And for some of these students, mental health is just not even discussed at home. There is just no, some of these students don't, I focused group some international students for a project I was working on, and some of them don't even, they are fluent in their kind of like language in their country of origin, but they don't even know the terms for depression or anxiety. It's just like not discussed as something that people really struggle with because you can't see it. So it's not a physical health problem. So I think there's a lot of psychoeducation that needs to happen in these populations, and like destigmatizing mental health treatment as a first step. Some other kind of practical actions that faculty can take, I think, is, and this could be also applied to students broadly, is just kind of making this connection between like their well-being and academic outcomes. Most students generally want to do well in school. They care about their grades. And so tying in how, or stressing that their mental health is related to like how their academic performance, and how there is a lot of evidence to show this, but also that it could impact how they're doing in a course because of how they feel and their motivation level. Kind of talking about it, especially to students who aren't familiar with like mental health as something that is talked about at home, talking about it in ways that they would understand in an academic setting.
Another question I want to ask, and I'll ask Nahed to address this question. What are your thoughts on pairing BIPOC, and we know that as minority and minoritized students and clients, with BIPOC identified clinicians? And so we know, of course, that that pairing may not even be possible, but the question is, what are your thoughts on being intentional with that pairing?
Yeah, that's a great question with no real straightforward answer, like a lot of things. But the issue really is, I think it's about options, right? I think we need to provide this option to students and let the student decide. There is some research around pairing minoritized students with BIPOC therapists. But the thing is, we got to remember that a big part of the therapeutic relationship is built on the relationship that the person has, that the student has, or the client has with the therapist. Sometimes that would be great when there is a shared experience where the student does not have to explain themselves, right? Like they say something and they already understand that you know what they mean, and they don't have to kind of provide any psychoeducation to you about like what that means for them. But that doesn't always work, and that doesn't mean that that works. So I think the real question is, are we able to provide this option for students so that they can pick, right? So that they can see somebody that looks like them, and so that they can see somebody who probably, hopefully understands their experience. But I think it would be really hard to assume that pairing a person of color student with a person of color therapist would always work out. But I think, like I said, representation really matters. And I think it's really important for students to have that option, because if you think about it from the other way around, this is not an issue that shows up for white students, because there is always an option there. And so it's not a question that we think about often, because it's kind of assumed that you will find somebody who looks like you, somebody who will understand your experience.
Nathan, did you want to address that question?
Yeah, or I can just quickly build on that, Nanu. I think that's really well put. And I think one of the biggest benefits is that it can decrease that potential barrier to entry, to say, you know what, I know Nathan, he's of Indian descent, I'm of Indian descent, I'm going to go try and see Nathan, whereas someone might not reach out if someone does not look like them, for example. But another way to achieve that goal, and just building off of one of the questions I quickly saw, is that having peer stories of students from marginalized communities, or minoritized, excuse me, who have reached out and have achieved success can be a great way to help with that. Knowing that I'm not the first person of color to go to this counseling center and receive support and have success can go a long way, because they can trust that person in a way that, you know, they might not trust a white clinician to say, no, I'm ready to go, I'm trained, I want to do this. So peer stories can go such a long way in helping getting students connected to care that they need.
I want to build on this too. You know, I think one of the issues in higher ed that we have is the pipeline and the availability of counselors with these identities. And so as we connect students into care and connected to this area of interest, ultimately another area we can work on in higher ed is expanding the pipeline of diverse clinicians to be able to, as Nahed was saying, give students options on their campus and make it so they are more likely to seek that professional help when they need it. But right now, it's not always an option for most campuses because there isn't a strong pipeline of diverse clinicians.
Other questions revolve around the virtual space that, of course, many clinicians are in, and of course instructors are in as well, especially as Omicron has surged. And one of the questions, and I'm going to ask Sasha to address this question and ask others to jump in. One question was this: in person, I would be willing to physically walk students to the counseling center. How do you do that virtually? The question, Sasha, is what are the challenges with regards to connecting students to help with their mental health virtually as opposed to in person?
That's a great question. And I think the first thing that comes into mind is that a lot of faculty members actually don't even know what the resources are on campus anymore. It has changed so much through the pandemic, and every institution has handled it so differently. So in one of our survey questions that we asked faculty, we found out that a list of mental health resources on campus would just be helpful. Most faculty don't have that at their institutions. And so when a student comes to them with distress, and let's say they've recognized it, or the student already has told them about the distress, they don't really know what the next step is, especially because a lot of faculty do not have training in this. And most of us are not mental health providers. And so I think just making sure that faculty know what the resources are on campus is really important. And I think just with the pandemic and this shift of going offline and online and in person, just doing what you can as an instructor in like the setting that you have. So like putting the mental health resources that you know on your syllabus so that it's always accessible to students, addressing mental health in the classroom, whether it's if you're teaching like a social science class, maybe as for me, it's easier because I'm in public health to like build mental health articles into your syllabus and the reading so that students have exposure to this, and just emphasize that this is important to you as an instructor, as well as their kind of academic success in the classroom. And then just thinking through like how to support student well-being without like connecting them to treatment services if you don't know, or if they're not available, or if the provider isn't right. Just being flexible at this time with kind of grading and deadlines. Like there are some strategies that you can use, like really lay out the process of how to request an extension. It was really not, even when I was going to school, I didn't know that you can actually request extensions, and that like, I think having faculty name that and like remove the shame of requesting an extension when you need a little bit help gives the student more support than they would have otherwise.
Two very brief things to add. One, a lot of faculty definitely don't know about the resources. Totally agree on that front. B, when we have PDFs, they get outdated really quickly. So luckily we live in a digital age, and there's a number of services that do provide that. So like you at college, we have a share button where if I have a student I know is in distress, I can actually email them the support service with the description of that and how to set up an appointment. But in the absence of that, I know this sounds so simple, but if I have a student and I say, hey, you should really call the counseling center, setting up a follow-up with that student in 2 days and say, hey, I'd like to touch base in 2 days at 12 o'clock and see if you were able to connect. And if not, if you get on that call at 12 o'clock 2 days later and that student wasn't able to connect, that's where we can get creative and say, you know what if we do a 3-way call right now? And we call the clinician and get you connected. Just because we're not in person doesn't mean we shouldn't creatively problem solve, because there's a lot of ways that we can still do some of that high touch work to connect students to where they need to get. Just using a medical analogy, if we knew a student was like bleeding right then in that moment, we would be so creative. We'd call a neighbor, we'd like figure it out. We'd call 911 on that student's behalf. With mental health, we also need to bring that level of urgency when indicated.
To build on that, and I think Sasha and Nathan, I really echo their sentiments. There's also a couple other things that campuses can do. Most campuses have a behavioral intervention team, and so that level of urgency that Nathan speaks to, there's usually spaces there to put in a referral for a student and have a case manager or care team, especially if as a faculty or staff member, you don't feel fully equipped or comfortable to work with that student. And then from an institutional perspective, so recently we worked with the Trevor Project looking at campus websites for crisis services. And we actually found that 66% of websites on over 1,800 campuses didn't include any mention of crisis referral numbers, whether it's local or national hotlines. And so getting to this idea of what are we providing to faculty and staff by putting those numbers on campus websites in a way where it's easy for faculty and staff and students to access them can just be one way that we're showing students we're committed, but also making sure that faculty and staff have quick access, like Nathan was saying, in this digital age where they can share that information when they're in a meeting with a student or via email.
I want to get to our live questions. We have a few I'd like to pose, but there's just one other question I'd like to pose that came before this session, and I'm going to ask Nahed to address it. A number of the questions, and we talked about this a little bit last time, revolve around how to partner with community resources. And this specifically, the question specifically talked about Hispanic serving institutions. historically Black institutions, or maybe even institutions that are in rural areas. They don't have the resources on campus. Any suggestions with regards to seeking community partners for the benefit of students' mental health in the head?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, I think in a place like Denver, you know, it's a fairly large city, and at the same time, we are, like Sasha was saying earlier, you know, we're understaffed, and we can't always serve the needs of students, and so we're always trying to create connections within the community and really trying to find maybe low cost counseling and things like that. And so part of what we do is outreach, is that we just kind of reach out to these centers and, you know, individual therapists and see who is able to offer these services. Sometimes we ask them to come and present to us about that so that our staff is able to recognize what's going on, and, you know, what services are happening, and what the cost is. So it's really, I think it just depends on the size of the university. It really depends on the size of the city, but I do think that it is important to keep those connections alive, and so that, you know, if you're wanting to refer somebody, you're not kind of scrambling and trying to figure out who do I send this person to, what do I do? Like, you already have a go-to person, and so we just kind of keep a pipeline going between you know, these community partners and us, so that the students are able to recognize them, and to also sometimes, instead of being like, hey, go to this specific place and then, you know, there's like 10 therapists in that community, if you know somebody in person and are able to do a warm handoff, I think that does help a lot.
Now, I want to kick it to some of our live questions, and I'm going to ask Nathan if you could address this one. This questioner asks, can you speak to how substance abuse recovery / 12-step groups are catered to minoritized students, if at all? Nathan, I was wondering if you could address that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to. In full disclosure, I am actually not a 12-step expert. I've had a number of clients who have gone to and attended to, and I've done a little bit of work with them. But from my understanding in the groups I've been involved with, specifically helping take teens to these programs in conjunction with therapy, every program tends to be very different. So what's happening in, you know, the Thursday night group might be extremely different from the Tuesday night group. Never mind being different from a group in Denver to rural, you know, Colorado, somewhere else. So I'm sorry, I don't have further information on that, but I would encourage you to get to know the norms of that specific group, because the leader and the person facilitating that ultimately is going to dictate that culture and any potential adaptations. Not sure if anyone else has more.
Speak to this. Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this. I agree with Nathan. Every group is different. And in a lot of my work with recovery communities on college campuses, what we've seen is it's the students who are there who are really helping shape the conversation and the needs. And many times it's connected to a counseling center or support there. So while the program or the 12 steps might not be tailored specifically to minoritized students, typically the conversation, and there's typically high levels of disclosure in these groups, can really shape the conversation and what's needed. But every campus is different. There are some campuses with really strong recovery programs. And if you're interested in recovery work, I highly encourage you to check out the Higher Education Center and their resources for building recovery communities, but also meeting the needs of diverse students.
You know, one of the most alarming trends and concerns for many institutions were when campuses were closed. Many institutions, many students didn't have a home to go to. You know, campuses were closed, and institutions said, go home. And a lot of the stress over housing insecurity has been particularly acute. And so one question came, how do we support students who couldn't go home during the break, or even more than that, may have not had a home to go go to amid all of these closures? I was wondering if anybody in the panel might want to address how do institutions deal with students who cannot go home and support their mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about what we did at the University of Denver, which is most of the dorms were closed, but we kept one of them open and kind of moved everybody there. So we had skeleton staff. We just needed the bare minimum of staff to kind of keep it running, and then had the students stay there, open the dining halls for specific periods of time. Obviously, had to change a lot of the food serving, that kind of thing, where it had to be just to-go meals, things like that, to kind of minimize student interaction. But it was possible for students to send a request and say, I can't go home, or whatever the case may be, and then be able to stay on campus for that.
Another question that came from our audience, and this is an interesting question indeed, and I'm going to throw out to the panel because I think it's particularly salient, and I think it speaks to some of the cultural and other barriers that minoritized students have in seeking mental health. One of the questioners asked, I'm going to throw out to the panel, what would you suggest for a students who ghost? What intervention would you recommend? And by ghost, meaning a appointment was scheduled, intervention was needed, and they decide that last minute, I'm gonna ghost, I'm gonna opt out of this session. I thought that was a particularly interesting question I want to throw out the panel. How do we handle students who at the end of the day ghost? Any thoughts on that one?
I love the question, and I'll take a swing. And obviously, this is another question with no one right answer. The first thing I do want to share is there's ghosting where we need to be really concerned. And then there's ghosting that's, you know what, maybe this student isn't ready to address this specific issue. So just to speak to the former, if we think there's a certain level of acuity, there's harm to self or others, that's where we have to go out of our way to find that student. One thing that's nice, we have emails, we know where most students live, we have contact information. So if there's imminent harm in any way, shape, or form, that's where we need to make that call and say, let's call campus police, let's connect and do that. Secondly, I think there are also ways to be persistent. If it's not quite an imminent situation, but we know that student would really benefit from care, I'd like to use the terminology of being politely persistent, of saying, I'm still here when you're ready to come in. Here's my next appointment, and go from there. And just make sure they know that you're available and ready to support, and that you're not angry or pissed off that they missed their appointment. A lot of times folks, truly miss an appointment for whatever reason. Maybe they were anxious, but then they're worried about what a clinician might think when they do come into that second session, which is creating a further barrier. So we just need to be empathetic and think about what it's like to have missed something. I think in our lives, just about everyone has done that intentionally or incidentally in one way, shape, or form, and we need to tap into that part of ourselves. I have some other thoughts, but I'm much more interested in hearing from other people.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you, Nathan. And I think the one thing to remember is to not take it personally, right? Especially when we remember that we work with students who do struggle with their mental health. So sometimes ghosting can be a manifestation of their mental health struggles, right? So they could have ADHD and forget about the appointment. They could have depression and are really unable to get out of bed and come to the appointment. They're maybe anxious and avoiding talking about their issues, whatever the case may be. I mean, there are like 200 explanations I can come up with right now, but I think sometimes, and this is something that I see with my trainees all the time, is that they do take it personally and they think, oh, I must be a bad therapist. But really have to remember the mental health struggles, but also the readiness, right? Therapy is great. And I suggest everybody goes to therapy. And at the same time, if you're not ready, it's not going to be effective. So sometimes, especially if they ghost, or there were multiple cancellations or no-shows, and then they keep ghosting, this might be a pattern that's worth exploring also, because this might be reflective of some other pattern that's happening in their life as well. So it could be a good point of intervention, but at the end of the day, if they don't want to come to therapy, we can't really force them.
And we have 1 more minute, and I have one last question I want to pose. is with regards to the intersection of disabled students and this population of minoritized students that we've talked about. As many institutions have closed, students with disabilities, again, have been negatively impacted most acutely. Any thoughts on understanding the needs of some of the students who are disabled specifically? That was a question that came in. I'm gonna throw out to the panel.
I think in respects to intersecting identities, we all have intersecting identities, and disability status is another example of such. And what we really need to be doing is be empathetic, and especially in terms of not being able to access many accommodations in person on campus that you might be able to virtually, we need to come up with workarounds and be able to go out of our way to support students who don't have they can't walk to, a tutor and meet one-on-one, for example. There's many accommodations that I know before becoming a clinician, I had no idea existed. And we really need to make sure we understand the complexities on top of other identities, which might be creating further barriers. Trying to be very quick with that one, because I know we're at time.
Yes, we are out of time. Nahed, Nathan, Amy, Sasha, I want to thank you so very much for sharing your expertise with our audience. I'd like to thank all who have registered and joined us for this special part 2 of our webcast on meeting the mental health needs of minority college students. I'd like to turn it back over to Wendy Sowers, our host. Wendy.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you so much for the panelists for joining and all the great questions and answers. I just want to tell you a little bit more about Diverse and some resources we do have available. You can please, of course, visit our website at diverseeducation.com to enhance your awareness, efforts, and engagement. We do offer various free newsletters. So if you're not a subscriber, go to our website, click subscribe, which can be found in the top right hamburger section. You can sign up for one of these free newsletters. You can also subscribe to our magazine in digital and print. And then, of course, we do have our Keep It Real Diverse game and workshops, which are just a great way to start the conversations with students and faculty. They help all the participants use shared values as a bridge, look for forward-thinking solutions and not just problems, and get past the individual lens and understand the systemic impact of racism. So you can go to the resources section of our website. And again, that can be found in the top right hamburger section. And lastly, it's time to nominate your outstanding sports scholars. Diverse sponsors the Arthur Ashe Junior Sports Scholars Awards to honor undergraduate minority student athletes who have excelled in the classroom as well as on the athletic field. The deadline is February 11th, so please go to the awards and honors section, again, on our website, which can be found in the top right hamburger section. And again, thank you so much for attending this Diverse Talk Live webcast. All the attendees will receive the recording of the session, and please stay tuned for other upcoming Diverse Talk Live webcasts. Thank you so much and have a great day.